Imagine flames clawing at a wooden hull and refusing to drown, licking seawater and sending rival ships into chaos. Now picture families hauling blocks of ice into a courtyard while the desert sun beats down, and that ice lasts for months. These sound like scenes from fantasy, but they were everyday realities in different corners of the ancient world. If you enjoy long-form stories about ancient technology and how it actually worked, consider subscribing for more deep dives like this. Today, we're going to walk through 5 inventions that feel impossible until you see how people actually built them. If you love tech history like this, hit subscribe. I do deep dives like this every week. Check the video description for sources and further reading if you want the academic papers and translations I mention. Start with the image that gives this episode half its title, Fire on the Ocean. Imagine a Byzantine fleet, oar blades flashing, banners snapping in the wind, and from the prow of some ships a black stream or a glowing spray that bursts into flame on the water itself. Contemporary chroniclers wrote about terror, about enemy ships burning as if the sea itself had taken fire. The weapon behind that image is most often called Greek fire, and it helped reshape naval warfare in the medieval Mediterranean. Greek fire is one of those technologies that sits halfway between engineering and secrecy. It was an incendiary compound used by the Byzantine Navy from roughly the 7th century onward, with a remarkable effect, a burning, clinging liquid that could be projected onto enemy ships and was notoriously difficult to extinguish. The Byzantines mounted delivery systems on their warships, primitive flamethrowers of the era, and they also seem to have used containers like ceramic pots or grenades for lobbing fire in sieges. The weapon was tightly tied to the state. Recipes and specialized operators were guarded, part of the machinery that gave Constantinople an edge when the city faced repeated sieges. What do we actually know about how it worked? Short answer, not precisely. The primary sources, chroniclers like Theophanes and later Byzantine manuals, describe the effects and deployment, not laboratory-grade formulas. Modern historians and chemists have suggested likely ingredients. Petroleum or some form of crude oil was almost certainly a component because it burns on water. Resins and pitch or tar would make the mixture sticky, helping it cling to a target. Some accounts hint at additives that made the blaze harder to put out, and scholars have debated whether quicklime, calcium oxide, or saltpeter played a role. Experiments with plausible mixtures can produce terrifyingly effective flames, but that doesn't mean we've rediscovered the exact ancient recipe.
The Byzantines didn't publish their formula, they kept it as a military secret, and the know-how was tied to craft, tools, and techniques, like specialized siphons, not just to a list of ingredients. Delivery matters almost as much as chemistry. Byzantine ships are described as carrying siphon-like tubes mounted on the prow, operated by trained crews, who could aim and pump a burning liquid at range. Contemporary opponents captured examples, copied fragments, or tried to reproduce the weapon, but often failed because they lacked the full package: the right fuel, the right additives, the right metallurgy, and the right engineering for safe storage and projection. That's a recurring theme across ancient technology. Recipe and tool chain go together. A recipe in a notebook without the tools and experience is only a promise. The strategic impact was real. Greek fire provided the Byzantines with a deterrent and a tactical option that complicated enemy plans. In naval battles, it could suppress boarding attempts, break tight formations, and turn a chaotic melee into a one-sided affair if one side could project burning liquid without setting its own ships alight. In sieges, incendiaries of many kinds have always been a force multiplier, but Greek fire's maritime application made it particularly effective in the narrow waters around Constantinople. The weapon's reputation alone could have psychological effects. Fear of a novel, hard-to-extinguish fire can undermine morale and slow sieges. Why did the knowledge fade? Multiple connected reasons. The Byzantine monopoly on the weapon depended on administrative continuity, skilled personnel, access to particular fuels and additives, and shipboard equipment. As the empire's fortunes shifted, political crises, sieges, changes in control, those networks frayed. Recipes that lived in the heads of a few specialists weren't copied into open treatises. When the chain of transmission broke, practical ways to project and store the incendiary were lost, even if traces of the underlying chemistry survived in other technologies. Later chroniclers describe the weapon, but no surviving authoritative recipe has been found. We can approximate and experiment, but that's different from reconstructing the exact Byzantine technique. It's worth saying something about sources and myth-making here. Some legends attribute the invention to a single genius, the oft-repeated name of a craftsperson, or even the idea of divine inspiration. But most historians think the weapon evolved through trial, adaptation, and the kind of practical secrecy states favor. When you read ancient or medieval accounts, expect a mix of technical report, propaganda, and storytelling. Theophanes, for instance, reports events with the priorities of a chronicler, not a chemist. That doesn't make his notes useless. It just means the gap between how people wrote about a thing and how it was actually made can be substantial.
Greek fire, then, sits at the intersection of material science and organizational control. A startling chemical effect was amplified by delivery technology and sustained by secrecy. Modern attempts to recreate the weapon make intriguing experiments, but they don't erase the historical reality that the original was embedded in a social, political, and naval system that we no longer have. This kind of careful, source-based exploration is what we do on this channel. If that approach matters to you, subscribing helps you keep following these investigations. A second wonder: Roman concrete. Not your rainy day sidewalk patch, but the mortar that built harbors, vaults, and domes that have lasted 2 millennia. Walk into Rome and you can still step beneath the Pantheon's coffered dome and feel how a material poured centuries ago supports itself with durable silence. In the seaside ruins of Ostia and ports across the Mediterranean, Roman marine concrete has resisted waves and salt in ways many modern mixes cannot. The Romans didn't invent the idea of cementitious binders, but they perfected a recipe and a construction culture that produced structures with remarkable longevity. The core ingredients sound simple: lime, volcanic ash, often from nearby regions, and coarse aggregate. That volcanic ash, known to modern engineers as pozzolana, is the secret that turns ordinary lime mortar into something that, when mixed with water, undergoes chemical reactions producing new minerals. Over time, these mineral products can grow and crystallize, filling microscopic cracks and binding components more tightly. In some marine contexts, Roman concrete actually reacted with seawater to create minerals that reinforce the matrix, a kind of slow, natural self-healing at the microscopic level. Technical words sneak in here, so a brief explanation. Pozzolanic reactions are chemical processes where silica and alumina in volcanic ash react with calcium from lime to form calcium-aluminum silicate hydrates, crystalline or gel-like mineral phases that glue the aggregate together. One phase often discussed in research is an aluminous tobermarate-like mineral, which when it forms in the concrete contributes to strength and durability. The important point for a popular audience is this: the Romans used a local volcanic ash that didn't just act as filler, it participated chemically, creating new minerals that made the structure tougher, especially in seawater. But Roman concrete has trade-offs. It's excellent in compression. That's why vaults and domes like the Pantheon work so well. The shape channels loads into compressive forces the material handles elegantly. It is not, however, naturally tensile. It doesn't stretch. Modern reinforced concrete solves that by embedding steel rebar to carry tension. That combination lets engineers build long-span bridges, high skyscrapers, and dynamic load-bearing structures impossible in ancient terms. Roman concrete was also variable in its setting time and dependent on specific aggregates. For certain contemporary uses, like high-rise construction or engineered frameworks subject to tension and bending, Roman mixes alone wouldn't be a safe swap. So why study it? Because Roman technology shows paths to more durable and potentially lower carbon materials. Modern concrete production is a massive source of CO2 emissions, largely because burning limestone to make cement releases carbon dioxide. Some researchers look to Roman recipes, the use of pozzolana and lower lime mixes cured in seawater, as inspiration to reduce emissions and create concrete that endures longer in marine environments. Engineers have reproduced aspects of Roman recipes in labs and built experimental structures, but wholesale replacement of modern reinforced concrete is neither practical nor desirable. Each era's building technology suits different needs. The survival of Roman concrete stems from local geology and craft knowledge. Regions with volcanic ash and lime made it easy to produce pozzolanic mixes. Where those raw materials were absent, builders went other routes. Also, Roman construction practices, careful placement, durable aggregates, and attention to mixing and curing mattered. Durability is rarely the product of a single secret ingredient. It's materials plus practice, plus sometimes environmental luck. If I pause for a moment to draw a through line between our first two technologies, a pattern begins to emerge. Both Greek fire and Roman concrete depended on materials that were locally available and often peculiar in their chemistry. Both required craft knowledge that wasn't just a recipe on a page, but embodied skill. Both gained advantages from being embedded in institutions that could maintain secrecy and quality. And in both cases, when those social and supply networks frayed, certain practices became harder to sustain. But chemical cleverness isn't limited to maritime fire and durable mortar. Move eastward for a moment and you find blades that fascinated swordsmen and scientists centuries later.
steel from India and the Near East, that for European eyes seemed to have an almost magical combination of hardness and resilience. These are the blades often grouped under the label Damascus steel. The name itself is tricky. Sometimes it refers to blades produced in the city of Damascus, sometimes to a pattern and performance associated with certain ingots and forging chains that traced back to places in South India and Sri Lanka where so-called wootz steel was produced. Wootz ingots, high-carbon steel crucible steels made in South Asia, were the raw material behind many of the famed blades. When forged and skillfully worked by master smiths, the steel could exhibit wavy surface patterns and remarkable cutting abilities.
The patterns come from microstructures and the distribution of carbides formed during cooling and forging, and because those patterns were visually striking, the blades became legendary. Traders and armies prized them. They moved along long craft and trade networks connecting ore sources, smelters, ingot makers, and smiths. Science entered this story centuries later. With microscopes and later electron microscopes, researchers studied museum blades and wootz samples to understand what made these swords exceptional. Some studies suggested complex microalloying, small amounts of elements like vanadium, nickel, manganese, and others, combined with particular thermal histories, could form elongated carbides and structures that conferred advantageous mechanical properties. A famous paper in the early 2000s suggested that some of the features looked like carbon nanotubes, or tubular carbides, sparking headlines about ancient nanotubes and implying modern nanotechnology had a historical antecedent. That claim energized the imagination, but also inspired careful scrutiny and debate. The microscopy work is subtle, sample-dependent, and interpretations can change with new techniques. The disappearance of the original wootz production and the precise, repeatable chain that made genuine early Damascus is another case of a technology woven into a supply and knowledge chain. Colonial disruption, changing trade patterns, and the loss of carbon-rich ore sources or particular smelting recipes could all have played roles. Skilled transmission matters too. Master smiths often guarded their methods. When communities changed or were displaced, the craft sometimes went with them. In later centuries, European bladesmiths emulated the look by pattern welding, forging layers of different iron and steel to create a visible pattern, which can mimic the aesthetic but not necessarily reproduce the original microstructure of wootz-derived blades. And here's another recurring point. Visual appearance and material performance are distinct axes. A blade with a wavy pattern might be prized for both practical and aesthetic reasons, but pattern alone doesn't prove performance. Conversely, very high-performance steels can look plain. The human story, markets, reputation, and the desire to own something both beautiful and effective propels technology as much as metallurgy. If the Damascus story feels like a bridge between myth and microscope, the next item on our list leans more toward narrative caution, a tale from Rome about a piece of glass so resilient it could be struck, dented, and remade, and about the political consequences of such a secret. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder and the satirist Petronius relay a story about a courtly scene in which a craftsman demonstrates an unusual flexible glass.
The story goes that an official or emperor, recognizing the value and potential disruption such a material could cause to the established order, ordered the craftsman executed to preserve the status quo. That anecdote has been repeated as evidence of a mysterious lost material, vitrum flexile, or flexible glass. There are two immediate ways to read this. One is to take it as a straight-up lost technology story. Someone made a new kind of glass, it threatened old markets, and power intervened to stop confusion. The other, more cautious reading, and the one most historians favor, treats the tale as literary and moralistic. Pliny and Petronius used anecdotes as moral instruction, satire, or to make points about luxury, hubris, and avarice. Archaeological evidence for a truly flexible glass of the sort the bedtime story version imagines is lacking. At the same time, ancient glassmakers did have techniques for tempering and annealing that could make glass tougher and less brittle, and it's possible that a practical demonstration, a hardened, slightly deformable glass object, sparked rumor and story. The flexible glass story is useful less as a catalog of lost recipes and more as a window into how ancient people thought about technology, its value, its social effects, and who controls it. Powerful people have long had reasons to control materials that change economic balances or social hierarchies. Whether a Roman emperor literally beheaded a craftsman over a beaker is less important than the insight that new technologies can threaten existing elites, and that stories of suppression circulate when markets and authority are at stake. These first four cases, Greek fire, Roman concrete, Damascus steel, and flexible glass, already sketch a pattern. material science grounded in local resources, skilled craft embedded in social institutions, and a thin line between justified secrecy and knowledge loss. Each entry brings a slightly different mix of evidence. For some, we have surviving structures and chemical clues. For others, only texts and the occasional artifact hinting at a complicated chain of production. Now, travel farther east into arid lands, and you find a technology that is both wonderfully practical and physically manifest in ruins, the Persian yakchal, or ice pit. In some Iranian deserts, tall, powder-finished dome-like structures rise like mirages across the landscape. From a distance, they look like mud brick beehives. Up close, they reveal incredibly thick walls, a subterranean storage chamber, and often a system of wind catchers and channels. These are the remnants of a refrigeration system that let communities produce and store ice in hot, dry climates for use in summer months. Yakchals relied on passive principles rather than mechanical refrigeration. Builders used a blend of adobe and lime mortar, often incorporating insulating materials. The thick walls, sometimes several meters thick at the base, provided thermal mass and insulation. The storage space was located underground, where temperatures are naturally lower. During winter nights, shallow pools of water would be spread thinly over large areas, and in the course of a cold, dry night, water could freeze. The ice blocks were then moved into the subterranean chamber, stacked and insulated with straw or other materials. Wind towers, known as badgears, caught prevailing breezes and channeled them to enhance evaporative cooling and ventilation. The design exploited diurnal temperature swings, low nighttime humidity, and clever architecture to preserve ice for months. Unlike some of the other marvels on this list, the yakchal is well attested in the archaeological and architectural record. The structures survive, their function is understandable in physical terms, and the cultural continuity is visible. The Persian word for modern refrigeration in some dialects derives from these ancient ice pits. That continuity speaks to a practical technology whose material logic was robust enough to be reused and adapted across centuries. There are also social takeaways. Where a community has an environmental reason to invest labor and material into a particular structure, in this case, a centralized communal refrigeration system, the technology persists. It's not a guarded imperial secret, it's a public good. That contrast with Greek fire is instructive. Some technologies are valuable precisely because they are secret and war-making. Others are valuable because they are shared and sustain daily life. If you lay these stories side by side, patterns keep emerging. Local materials matter. Supply chains and institutions matter. Techniques are often social inventions as much as material ones. Some technologies survive because they're embedded in architecture and leave hard evidence. Others vanish because their knowledge was concentrated in a fragile network that could be severed by war, migration, or policy. Myths cluster around exceptional materials, and those myths tell us about human priorities as much as about metallurgy or chemistry. At this point, you might be wondering about the modern stakes. Why does any of this matter beyond curiosity and a good story? First, history informs engineering. Researchers look to Roman concrete for clues on durability and to ancient metallurgy for ways different raw materials and processes affect performance. Second, understanding the social context of technology helps us think about resilience. How do we keep essential know-how alive? Third, these stories caution us against two temptations: romanticizing the past as uniformly superior and dismissing ancient ingenuity as primitive. The truth is both more interesting and more useful. Ancient people solved specific problems with clever combinations of materials, craft, and organization, and those lessons can inspire contemporary design.
Before we push deeper into metallurgy and microstructures, the small, surprising features that made Damascus blades so sought after, a brief reminder about evidence. When I name a chronicle or a scientist, I'll put papers and translations in the description below. Many of the scenes I've described come from sources separated by centuries and languages, combined with modern lab work. Where the ancient texts speak, I treat them as historical documents shaped by genre and agenda. Where laboratory work speaks, I treat it as provisional and open to refinement. We're comfortable living with a little uncertainty here. It's part of what makes the story attractive. Next up, we'll look closely at the threads that made Damascus steel exceptional: trade routes, crucible steel production in South Asia, and microscopic structures that some researchers suggested could be early forms of carbon nanotubes. You'd expect microscopy to settle the matter, but metallurgy and history together create a more complicated picture, and sometimes the materials refuse to tell a single story. Stay with me. The instruments, the controversies, and the human story behind those blades reveal as much about modern science as they do about ancient craft. So let's zoom in on those blades, the ones whose surface seems to ripple like water and whose reputation traveled farther than any single swordmaker. When people say Damascus steel, they usually mean two intertwined things: a look and a legend. The look is the wavy, watery pattern along the blade. The legend is a steel that somehow combined razor-sharp cutting power with toughness that resisted shattering. Both are real in a sense, but both require careful unpacking. Start with the raw material, woots. Woots was a crucible steel produced in parts of South Asia beginning over 1,000 years ago. Craftspeople smelted iron with carbon in small closed crucibles, producing ingots with high and relatively uniform carbon content. Those ingots then traveled by trade routes that connected India, the Persian Gulf, and the Near East to mastersmiths in places like Damascus, where forging and heat treatment turned the ingots into finished blades, prized for both performance and beauty. The commodity was not just metal, it was a bundle of knowledge: ore selection, smelting technique, temperature control, and post-smelt handling. Disrupt any link in that chain: a lost mine, a displaced smelter, a break in trade, and the final product changes. So what gave these blades their properties? Metalworkers and scientists have pointed to a few likely contributors. First, the carbon content and the distribution of carbides, microscopic particles of iron carbide, play a huge role in hardness and wear resistance. Second, trace elements in the ore or the crucible, like vanadium or nickel, can seed particular microstructures during cooling.
Third, the thermal history, how the metal was heated and quenched, controls the formation of different phases inside the steel. At the microscale, elongated carbides arranged in certain patterns and a matrix that balanced hard and more ductile phases could produce a blade that both held an edge and resisted catastrophic fracture. In the early 2000s, a high-profile paper grabbed headlines by suggesting some of the tubular features observed in electron microscopy resembled carbon nanotubes, a modern nanomaterial with extraordinary mechanical properties. That headline, "Ancient Nanotubes," was irresistible to popular media. But science is rarely settled by one dramatic image. Subsequent analyses have debated the interpretation. Are those tubular features true nanotubes, or are they artifacts of sampling, corrosion, or the imaging process? Different blades show different microstructures, and museum samples are often corroded or thermally altered across centuries. The responsible takeaway is this: some Woots-based blades show exotic, complex microstructures that contributed to their performance. Claiming the ancients were intentionally producing nanomaterials like we do today overstates both the evidence and the continuity of technique. It's better to say that careful control of composition and heat treatment produced microstructures that look remarkable under modern microscopes, and that modern material science is still learning how to interpret those patterns in the context of performance. Another important distinction is between original Damascus blades and later Damascus-style swords. European smiths, eager to reproduce the pattern, developed pattern welding, stacking, twisting, and forging different steels to create a surface pattern that visually mimicked the Woots waves. Pattern-welded blades can be very good historically and can look spectacular, but the metallurgical mechanism is not identical to Woots-derived patterning. In other words, you can copy the aesthetic without copying the precise internal microstructure that a specific Woots ingot gave to a Damascus blade. Why did the original chain of production break? It's a tangle of economic, political, and geological reasons. Colonial-era disruptions shifted trade routes and demand. Local furnaces and sources of specific ores could disappear under pressure from war, migration, or environmental change. The craft itself often depended on guild-like secrecy. Master metallurgists guarded skills that took years to master. When a community that hosted those masters was displaced, the tact knowledge could vanish with them. So the mystery of lost Damascus is not a single missing ingredient. It's the disappearance of a distributed, tightly knit production ecosystem. Modern metallurgists and bladesmiths have tried, often with great skill, to reproduce aspects of the original.
Some experiments have successfully recreated blades with comparable edge retention and toughness, and some modern analyses reproduce the kind of carbide distribution you see in museum pieces. But caution matters. The surviving blades have a complex history of corrosion, repair, and use. Extracting an absolute universal recipe from them is like reconstructing a chef's entire technique from a browned corner of a pan. The lessons are humbling and illuminating. We see how subtle changes in raw materials and heat treatments shift performance, And we appreciate how pre-industrial craftsmen achieved controlled results through experience rather than scientific formulas. If you enjoyed that metallurgy detour, here's a little rhetorical switch, a story that looks less like a lab report and more like a moral tale from a Roman dinner party. Ancient authors, Pliny the Elder and the satirist Contronius among them, preserve an anecdote about flexible glass. According to these sources, an inventor presented a glass object at court which could be struck and dented and then reshaped. The punchline of some versions is grim. The ruler, fearing the economic and social consequences of such a material, a cheap and unbreakable glass undermining the value of silver and goldware, orders the craftsman punished, sometimes violently. The story has become a favorite example of technological suppression. As with most good anecdotes, it's useful for revealing social dynamics more than for establishing material fact. Pliny wrote in the 1st century CE and often combined observation with moral commentary. Petronius wrote satire that skeeled Roman elite behavior. Do we have archaeological glass objects that behave the way the story describes? No convincing examples of a truly flexible ancient glass have turned up. But we do know Roman and pre-Roman glassmakers were sophisticated. They knew how to blow, anneal, and temper glass, and could make vessels that resisted ordinary breakage better than most casual readers expect. Annealing, which relieves internal stresses by controlled cooling, and certain surface treatments can make glass less brittle. It's plausible that someone produced an exceptionally tough vessel, and that the demonstration inspired rumor, envy, and political worry. Why keep this story in the package? It's not because it proves a lost supermaterial. It's because the narrative shows how technology and politics mix. When a new material threatens existing economic arrangements, cheap glass challenging silverware, a new textile undermining local workshops, powerful actors can react defensively. That reaction can be rhetorical, legal, or, in the most dramatic retellings, lethal. Even if the execution story is apocryphal, the moral point stands. Technology rarely floats free of social context. We've covered flaming war liquids, self-healing mortar, nanostructured blades, and a cautionary Roman tale.
Now, look back over the map. What underlying themes keep popping up? One is raw materials, not just iron or ash, but the precise local chemistry of ore, volcanic ash, or crude oils. Another is craft knowledge, the tacit, embodied practice that lives in workshops and hands rather than in treatises. A third is networks, trade routes, imperial bureaucracies, and guilds that move materials and retain secrets. A fourth is the difference between an object's visible features and its hidden properties, what a blade looks like versus how its microstructure actually behaves. And finally, myths and anecdotes often fill gaps where physical evidence is sparse. They tell us about human reactions to innovation, even if they don't give us laboratory protocols. Those themes have modern relevance. Engineers study Roman concrete to learn how mineral faces created over centuries can heal microcracks, and how using alternative binders might reduce our carbon footprint. Metallurgists study woots and historical blades to understand how trace elements and heat treatment interact, feeding both material science and conservation. Architects and cultural heritage teams examine Yakchal ruins to learn low-energy cooling methods that might inform passive climate control in hot regions today. And historians examine stories like the flexible glass anecdote to think about how power shapes technological diffusion. A word about experiments and claims. In all these areas, researchers have tried to reproduce effects, not to weaponize ancient recipes, but to understand mechanisms. Lab reconstructions of Greek fire-like mixtures demonstrate plausible combustion behavior at sea. Experimental concretes based on puzzolenic principles show improved durability in chloride-rich environments. Bladesmiths combine modern metallurgy with historical techniques to test hypotheses about microstructure. Those studies are valuable, but they don't magically restore an ancient production ecosystem. The original technologies were social as well as technical. Recreating the metal is not the same thing as restoring the smithing tradition, the trade network, or the institutional setting in which the technology thrived. There's also a second caution. Ancient excellence is not always a universal superiority claim. Roman marine concrete survived for centuries in specific environments, but it doesn't solve every structural problem modern engineers face. Wootz blades were highly prized, but modern steels and heat treatments outperform them in many controlled metrics. Context matters. Ancient people optimized for the problems and resources they had: seawalls and lime-rich volcanic ash around a Mediterranean port, desert sun and shallow pools in Iranian courtyards, trade routes that carried crucible steel to far-off workshops.
So what can we take away?
First, admiration without myth. These technologies are impressive because people solved nitty-gritty engineering problems with limited tools, clever materials choices, and skilled labor. Second, nuance. Loss does not mean superior, and surviving does not mean simple. Third, inspiration. Ancient techniques can seed modern innovation, especially where designers are trying to reduce energy use or design for longevity rather than planned obsolescence. If you're picturing a headline, "Ancients had super technology," I'll gently push back. The real story is richer. A weave of chemistry, craft, trade, and politics produced results that sometimes seem magical to us because we don't often see the whole chain that made them possible. When that chain was robust, structures endured and reputations spread. When it shattered, the skills could go with it. Before we wrap, a couple of small practical notes for curious viewers. If you want the academic and translation work behind the snippets I mentioned, check the description. I've linked a few accessible papers and primary source translations, including collections of Theophanes' Chronicle, translations of Pliny, and some of the metallurgical studies that analyzed Wootz and Roman concrete. I've avoided piling heavy citations into the spoken narrative because it complicates the cadence, but the sources are there if you want to dive deeper. And now, a final, slightly selfish question to you. Which of these ancient inventions surprised you most? Was it flames that could chase an enemy across the sea? Concrete that strengthens in salt water? A blade whose microstructure confounded centuries? A rumor of flexible glass and imperial paranoia? Or massive domes that kept ice through summer? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and I'm always curious which thread you want pulled next. Want to follow up? Let me know whether I should dig further into naval weaponry and its logistics, do a material science deep dive on Roman mortar, or trace the trade routes and human stories of Wootz steel. If you found this dive into ancient technology fascinating, consider subscribing to the channel. We publish new history and science deep dives every day. Feel free to like the video and share it with someone who enjoys the intersection of history and material science. Ancient engineers solved extraordinary problems, and the more closely we examine their work, the clearer it becomes that modern innovation often depends as much on rediscovering past practices as on inventing new formulas. Until the next deep dive.